Welcome to New York Bio's virtual breakfast series, a digital program started in 2020, bringing you fireside chats with leaders from across the healthcare spectrum. This week's episode features Patroski Lawson, CEO of the KPM Group.
All right. Good morning. My name is Jennifer Hawks Bland, and I'm the CEO at New York Bio. And we are thrilled you're here to join us for another edition of our virtual breakfast series. A special thanks to Cooley for sponsoring this month's series of breakfast. Today, we have the honor of talking with Patroski Lawson, who is he's really much more than a government affairs professional. And we'll let you make the call as to what moniker we should use for Patroski at the end of our discussion today. Before I forget, because I tend to do this, please, housekeeping, please ask your questions in either the chat or the Q&A box. I know that you will have some for Patroski as we go through our conversation. So please put those in there, and Mary and I will get to them as we go through the course of our discussion. For those regular attendees, you'll notice that we have two ladies today. We have no Derek. Derek is on vacation this week, so we wish him all the best, and we will carry on in his absence.
Yes.
Mary Bartlett from my team is joining us. So Patroski, we always start with an origin story because it's really important for our audience of entrepreneurs and academics and those in the service industry to kind of understand how our guests get to the point where they might be featured right on a New York Bio breakfast. And your story is interesting. It's not linear, which I find the most interesting stories are not. So talk to us a little bit about how you even became interested in advocacy, government affairs, and how you wound your way through roles to where you are helping early stage companies today.
Great. Well, thank you for the opportunity to be here. And I hope you guys enjoy my green background here, the curtain in the room that I'm in. It's just beautiful and lovely. So you're welcome.
You're still channeling St. Patrick's Day, Patroski.
Exactly. So my story began really, I started volunteering on political campaigns when I was like 17 years old and worked on the Lawton Childs campaign and then worked on the Bush 41, the first Bush to volunteer down in South Georgia, where I'm from, and then worked for Paul Coverdell on the Paul Coverdell campaign when he ran for U.S. Senate back in 1992. And was fortunate enough after graduate school to get a job with Paul Coverdell in Georgia and ran he was really in charge, sort of ahead of his time. He wanted to focus on minority outreach, and he was a Republican senator and who had just barely squeaked by Jennifer in his first election in 92. And he's like, I got to do better. I got to do more to reach out to different communities across Georgia. And so I spent 2 years with him doing a lot of community organizing and around African-American churches and with law enforcement and whatnot. And he was able to, as a result of that engagement for 2 years that I was with him, go from 2% of the African-American population to 12%. And so he won his reelection rather handily. And he would, if he were with us today, would say it was in large part because of the work that he and I and others did to sort of really raise and elevate his voice in a community that he was not well known in. And there's a similar arc there. The reason I tell that story is because I've sort of been very interested in being a bridge builder and bringing people together and breaking down barriers and all of that. So every job in government affairs that I've had since has sort of led me to this point where I am now, where that's what I do on a day in and day out basis. So
how did you, and I, in full disclosure, I followed a similar course. I worked for another Southern senator, right out of undergrad, Senator Cochran, who worked very closely with Senator Coverdell on ag stuff. And so how did you find the transition from like doing more of the grassroots constituent services work that I'm assuming you were doing right within the state to looking at policy impacts, and how did you move in that direction?
So great question. I went from working from Coverdell's office that sort of got me into this. And you're right, it was a lot of local government affairs, local grassroots and stakeholder engagement and whatnot. Transition to Home Depot, where my Home Depot experience was really all about, it was a perfect sort of segue because the Home Depot career, I ran the PAC and I was responsible for all of their grassroots efforts, which meant I got to, if Senator Cochran or Senator Coverdale visited a store in Mississippi in, Biloxi or whatever, I might be there to greet him and introduce him to the community and introduce him to the employees at that store. So that sort of community organizing on the corporate government affairs side was sort of my first foray into professional government affairs and policy work. And so that sort of was easy. And then when I went to transition from Home Depot to Solvay, that's when I really started to get into policy issues writ large that impacted healthcare. Because at Home Depot, it really was about the policy issues were really around NIMBYism, not in my backyard. Big box retail issues, if you recall. So that's all local government affairs and grassroots organizing and whatnot. The Solvay experience was a little bit different because it was more traditional state government affairs, policy work around market access, providing access to products and things of that nature. So that, I'm not sure if I'm answering your question correctly, but that's sort of the segue from local grassroots organizing to policy.
And for you and the audience, there are no correct or incorrect answers in a New York Bio virtual breakfast. And by the way, we lived in Atlanta for 8 years, and we lived less than a mile from Home Depot headquarters and the store that was across the street from Home Depot headquarters. And I will forever miss that Home Depot. It was the nicest Home Depot ever.
Because it's where we would use, when we would have elected officials in town and we wanted to showcase, we would take them to that store. Or as you know, any kind of store walks with the executive team, that's where they did it. So it was on point all the time. Good.
You walked in there and 10 minutes later, you walked out with stuff you needed and you didn't need.
For sure.
And then, so you had obviously been so immersed in sort of local politics, local politicians. Then with Solvay, you went to a company that was not a U.S. origin company, right? So talk to us about that experience of moving into sort of a U.S. role with an international company.
Oh, that's a great question. So what's fascinating about my Solvay experience is that it was a hybrid. It was a matrix or hybrid organization. They were in chemicals, they were in plastics, and they were in pharmaceuticals. So it sort of touched all of those different spots. And as the government affairs lead, I was there for almost 10 years. And then that time I'd been promoted 3 times. And by the time I'd left, I was in charge of the function, but also had a hybrid role where 30% of my responsibility was international, was global, which was kind of cool because I got to travel mostly to Europe. And so your question is great because I sort of straddle the pharma, chemicals, and plastics world in that hybrid role. And so working for Solvay, it was very interesting because ex-US, they all recognized that the United States was where on the pharmaceutical side is where innovation is rewarded and where they could, for lack of a better term, really be innovative and have access to patients and to grow a pharmaceutical business. Outside the United States, it was fascinating because it was primarily all about government price control and whatnot. So they were always very interested and looked to the US as a center of excellence when it came to policy and when it came to patient engagement, because outside the US, it was really kind of, all about making sure that you could negotiate your price with the governmental authorities. And so it wasn't particularly interesting for them, for a lot of these companies, and Solvay included, to work in France or in Germany. They had to be there because they needed to be there to provide access to patients, Jennifer, but they really wanted to be in the US because they felt like that's where they could not just make money, but you can express your individuality in a lot of ways you couldn't outside US.
And the government relations that you did in, Europe, did you feel like that was tough to learn coming from just the United States and the nuance of advocating in another country?
It's all the same everywhere. It's personal relationships. It's really looking people in the eye. It's about transformational relationships, not transactional relationships, Mary. So it really isn't that hard anywhere in the world. I'm just going to be brutally honest. It takes time to do it well, but you really have to lean into, okay, am I here to try to build a transformational relationship, or am I just trying to get them to do something for me on this particular bill, this particular legislation? People can see, they can spot a faker or a poser a mile away. And I always tried to be authentic and to try to build transformational relationships. So that's how I sort of approached it. That's number one. And the second thing I would say is that they're very fascinated in Europe about how America works. And this is when I worked, my heyday was around 2008. So it was Hillary Clinton running against Barack Obama. Wherever you went in Europe, they were all, they give you the side eye because they'd want to know, are you
where are you?
Where are you? Or which side of the aisle are you on? And then based on which side of the aisle you were on, you got a different conversation, people. Because with Bush was not beloved in Europe. Now they love him. I mean, relatively speaking, after our Trump experience, that people view Bush slightly differently now. But that's a whole different conversation. But it's Mary, it's all wrapped up in sort of personal relationships and really going deep with people, and then you can really go far with your policy agenda. That's been my experience.
I think that's great. Yeah, and sometimes by necessity, an interaction is transactional, but that shouldn't be the overarching approach.
Right. There's the cost. There's some of that you have to do no matter, because life is about cost. It's cost of doing business, if you will. But that's different, and a lot of people can recognize, because we all have to do that. I scratch your back, you scratch mine. Quick, that kind of stuff. But it's to really go deep with someone and to really forge a relationship that survives ebbs and peaks and valleys. You really have to think about it differently. So
yeah, and that's the same with community building, right?
Right.
Reaching out for relationships and making those connections in the good times and the bad, and then having sort of those standing relationships, right?
Absolutely. And it's building them before you need them. And I know this is all kind of interwoven through this conversation. Is one key point I want to really emphasize is the time to make friends is when you don't need them. Okay. And so I have built my career professionally and personally based on that edict. That is that you and I mean, we're friends, not because, you need something from me or I need something from you. Hopefully we'll never get to a point in a relationship where you pick up the phone and say, Patroski, I need X, or Patroski or Mary, I need Y. Friendship is a friendship is a friendship. However, that if you needed to pick up the phone at the 11th hour, Patroski, I'd like for you to do, can you help me with this? I'm going to be there for you, because you're not calling me at 11th hour, hair on fire. And I'm like, who are you? I have no idea who you are and where you came from. Sure, I'm going to help you because I'm a nice person and I help everyone. But I certainly would be more likely to help you if I'd known who you were 5 years before, So, I mean, I'm being silly for effect.
Yeah.
You get my.
So what about, and you hold a unique position. I find that often we end up in one. So if you're a young professional and you go sort of the Capitol Hill government affairs route, right, which is, somewhat of a standard route, you tend to you find one area and then you become an expertise in some, policy advocacy area. In your case, you had the chemicals background. In my case, I worked on ag policy, right? Agricultural, for those who have no idea, agricultural policy, and then shifted and, worked in pharma. But for you, how did you find the difference in advocating for entirely different issue areas? Was your approach different? Was your approach the same? How did people receive information differently?
That's a good question. I'm pretty self-aware now. Maybe I wasn't then. And so now my focus is really on rare disease and brain health. But back then, I was doing, like you said, chemicals, plastics, and mostly pharmaceuticals. But there were times when I had to dabble in those other spaces. I think what I do really, really well is that I brought in other people who had subject matter expertise in those areas that I didn't, and learn from them. So I remember Arian Arian Brent, who was my colleague at Solvay many, many years ago. I was doing pharmaceuticals, and then she was brought into the organization to focus primarily on plastics and chemicals. And it was great because then we became partners, and then we would cross-pollinate. If I knew a specific approach to an issue on the pharma side, I would work with her to sort of bring that same policy focus on the chemicals and plastic side. And I do think that regardless of the issue, there are commonalities in how you approach the issue. And so what I did uniquely was I would partner with people who had more expertise in that space than I did. I didn't try to be all things to all people. Again, really being self-aware. That was sort of my approach there. And there was a second part of your question. I want to make sure I answered that.
Oh, and just how that's changed. Like, is it different now than it used to be? Like when you started?
It is different now because, and I'm going to get all tech or business focused on you. So I've implemented a system called EOS in our company, in entrepreneurial operating system. And what it has forced me to do is to really become laser focused on what is my niche and what is our hedgehog principle. So, and what I've learned is that what you want to try and do is to simplify what it is that you're trying to do and not try to be all things to all people. So I've sort of doubled down on this idea of self-awareness, that where I want to be. Rare disease is sort of an area that is very extremely important to me. CNS is another area, brain health, central nervous system diseases, disorders, very important. And everything else I'm going to block out. Now, if someone comes to me and says, Patroski, I need your help in cancer, which happens, or diabetes, or I'm going to help them, but I'm going to upfront say, maybe I'm not the best person for you. Let's bring in a subject matter expert who can help you. Because I really do think it's important, Jennifer, to be completely self-aware that what are you going to be the best in the world at, and really laser focus there. And so it has become easier. 15 years ago in my career, I would try to say yes to everyone. Yeah. Now I've become more adept at saying no to people if it doesn't fit into what it is that I feel that I'm really, really good at, or what it is that I'm passionate about.
Right.
So
I think if we had more people take that approach, work would be some, more easy sometimes. We have a great question from our friend David Lockman at Bio, and I'm just going to read it because he laid it out very nicely. The biopharma industry faces an interesting advocacy paradox these days. Most of the elected officials who represent our top innovators are among the most hostile. And he's talking about geographically, like where our industry has the most investment in the US. Normally, all politics is, as Tip O'Neill liked to remind us, local. I'm not aware of another industry that faces a situation like this. What are your thoughts on doing advocacy in the current environment?
I think it's more. We have to do more. I think more advocacy is necessary. They're not particularly savvy. And here's the other piece too. I think with people like the Massachusetts congressional delegation in particular, I'll not name names, and then is Big Pharma has done a really good job of influencing policymakers and politicians in a way that small pharma and bio as a trade association have not. And I think that one of the reasons why I like to represent the companies that we represent at KPM is because we want to give them a seat at the table. And so I think more conversations are needed, not less. But I also think it's more conversations, it's different messengers than what we've typically seen. It's not hotshot lobbyists and multi-$1,000 suits. It's patients, it's lab coats, it's the bench scientists and companies. They need, if you think about it, who are the most influential people in the biotech space? And when it comes to talking to the public, policymakers, the press, you name it, it's patients. Everyone agrees with that. They are sort of number one. Well, who's number two? I think it's probably the bench scientists in companies, the people who are actually doing the innovating. We don't hear from them, Jennifer. We need to hear more from them. So my answer would be, we need to double down on the influence game. We need more conversations at the local level, at the state level, at the global level with companies. And more importantly, we need the right people at the table, not CEOs. I love taking CEOs to the hill. Actually, they need to be there too, quite frankly. But we need more lab coat lobbyists running around, truly explaining to people exactly why they're in this game too, why they're in this business of innovating too, because that's an important message that I don't think that policymakers hear enough about, frankly.
Yeah, and I think that my background before New York Bio was with a non-for-profit patient advocacy organization, and we focused on leveling up patients, really making them true advocates and trained advocates. We rarely tackled the innovation part of advocacy because there were so many barriers to care, just getting access to the medications and the treatments that had come out already. So I'd love to know what you think about how to make patients advocates for innovation too, when that's not always at the front of a patient advocacy organization's mind.
I think honestly, I think the patients do a really good job of advocating for innovation. Maybe it could be more coordinated with industry, depending on what sector of biotech. I feel like on the rare disease side, I think the patient advocacy groups do a really good job of advocating for the need for more novel therapies to treat certain conditions. If you see the Sarepta model, probably going to get in trouble for bringing them up individually, but my friend Jen McNary, who is a rare mom, I mean, these moms and dads can move mountains on behalf of their kids. I do think that there could be more coordinated efforts between individual companies. Like I feel like NORD does a good job, Every Life, all of these Global Genes, all of these organizations do a really good job of advancing the patient narrative to a certain extent. I think that the business community, biotech, has to do more. I think they have to lean into rallying their individual patient groups and bringing them to the hill, bringing them into states and local communities. I don't think that that's coordinated enough. I think a lot of it is disjointed. So that would be one place. If I was a CEO of a company, I would direct my chief patient engagement officer, because I think every company should have one, not someone that's buried 7 layers in the organization that's a patient advocacy coordinator or whatever. Screw that. It needs to be a chief patient engagement officer at every biotech company that sits on the CEO's leadership team that's coordinating all of these efforts strategically across the organization. And at that level, business and the patient community should be, and the patient groups that organization's working with should be locked, arm in arm on strategy. And part of that strategy is advocacy strategy and making sure that innovation story gets told on the Hill or across all channels, not just the Hill, not just in the media, but across all channels. So that would be.
Sorry,
go ahead, Mary.
Well, I was just going to say, we at New York Bio have a focus on patients and patient advocacy. We have a patient engagement summit coming up in early April 6th. And we put a lot of emphasis on building those bridges between patients, specifically with rare disease, conditions, to the biotech companies that maybe aren't as big to have chief patient officers or, a couple guys in a lab, really getting them to think about the patients too.
That's awesome. I mean, and I think that more is needed. Every day, all day, doing what you're doing with the Patient Engagement Summit. I think that is a beautiful thing, because I do think that that's where you could be one of your hedgehog principles. It's like, as an organization, this is one of the things we're going to lean into, really bridging the patient and the innovator together to do great things. So I applaud you for that.
So let's take a step back, because our audience, and you think about it, and you well know this, right? You've worked in New York, you have clients in New York. We have a lot of earlier stage companies, as Mary just alluded to. So put yourself in the seat. I am a CEO of a preclinical biotech company in New York. How do I know I should be talking to patients or patient advocates. Maybe I'm thinking about advocacy, but not really. Isn't somebody else doing that? Isn't isn't pharma taking care of that, right? So talk to me and our audience about when you should start thinking about advocacy, engagement, patient engagement. Like, when in the life of the company should you even start thinking that way?
Well, the easy answer is at the very beginning, right? I mean, you shouldn't form the company or go into it without having thought through all of that. But I realize that a lot of CEOs and executives in C-suites or whatever, like you said, they're in the lab and there's one or two of them. They're like, I'm just trying to figure it out, you know? The easy answer is at the very beginning. And it's never too early to engage in advocacy, government affairs, patient engagement. And the earlier the better, because the earlier you engage around patient advocacy and government affairs, and the more strategic it is and the less reactive and less tactical it becomes later on. Because if it's upstream, I say upstream, use these terms, upstream, downstream. You want to use government affairs and public affairs and patient engagement and advocacy upstream to help inform what you do downstream. And so never too early. If I were a CEO, I would want to make sure that I knew my town mayor, county commissioner, my state rep, my state senator, my 2 US senators, and my governor personally. That's would be what I would expect from a CEO. And going back to my Home Depot experience, I watched that. I watched Bernie and Arthur, Bernie Marcus and Arthur Blank were the one was chairman and one was CEO at the time. Arthur was dialed in on the Democrat side and knew everyone. Bernie knew President Bush and was actually with President Bush when he was Governor Bush, and he decided that he was going to run for president. Imagine having the kind of relationship with someone who could eventually mature into that role, and building a relationship and what that could do for you as you build a company. It really, really, I have seen it work where a relationship with a US senator or governor, I've used it personally when I was in Georgia for Solvay. We were vying for an influenza vaccine grant from the federal government. And because of the relationships I'd forged with Johnny Isaacson and Saxby Chambliss and Governor Perdue, knew them personally, knew their staffs personally for years, over years, was able to make well-placed phone calls. And they were able to make well-placed phone calls to Secretary Leavitt at the time at HHS, who obviously was President Bush's, President Bush was president at the time, of course. And all of that is to say, Solvay, of all the companies that received a federal award from the government, Solvay came in #1, and everyone was scratching their head. They're like, how in the hell did you guys do that? You got more money than Sanofi, all the other big players in the vaccine space at that time. And I was like, well, I don't know how we did that. But again, so Jennifer, not to, just to put a finer point on it, early, because early informed strategy. Late is expensive. Late may not get you over the finish line. Early, you still may not get over the finish line, but at least you'll know. You'll have the benefit of time of knowing what your challenges and opportunities are. But if you wait late, you may never know. So,
yeah. And a shameless plug, I should say. New York Bio, for those of you on the phone and on the video who are members of New York Bio, we have a government affairs committee. And as a member, you should and are welcome to participate in that, in those meetings and those discussions to help set our organization strategy. So if you don't know if you're on it, reach out to me afterwards and we'll make sure you're connected. Mary?
Yeah, we've got another question from Eric Floyd. He says, can you please share your experience in transitioning from working at Lundbeck and establishing your own company?
Oh, wow. So thank you, Eric, for that question. It's great to know that you're out there. You've been a great friend and mentor to me. So it's nice to Nice for you to tee up that wonderful question. So, in our line of work, we've all been sort of laid off, or it's just the nature of the beast. It's always happened. And at Lundbeck, my boss walks in at 4 and says, "I'm going in a different direction." And by 5 o'clock, my computer, my phone, the HR is waiting outside to get me to sign the separation papers. Didn't see it coming, probably should have, but we've all been there, and I'm very proud of the work I did at Lundbeck, and that's just the way it goes. So I'm sitting there with a 1-year-old son, and the only person in my family who was working. I'm going to try not to get emotional because it was really tough. And I just for a year, I looked at jobs, I got to the finish line, for 3 or 4 opportunities, and it always went to the other person, which is fine because at this level, it's all about fit. And sometimes, it really is just about fit, not about qualification. So I turned to my wife after the last one and said, we should just, what are we doing? Let's just go and let's just start our own business. And so the next day we made a bet with each other where she said, how long do you think it's going to take you to get your first client? I'm going to be quick here. How long is it going to take you to get your first client? I said, 6 months. She said, well, I think it's going to take 30 days. Let's bet. I'm like, all right, what are we going to bet? She said, I don't know, a bottle of wine, since that's kind of your jam. So we bet a bottle of wine that it would take 30 days or 60 days. Well, she won the bet. Day 29, I get a call from a friend that needed some help, and the first client was Ultragenics, a rare disease company out of California,
and member of New York Bio.
yeah. And Betsy Ricketts called and said, "Hey, would you be interested?" I'm like, of course I'd be interested, and went down, said yes, went downstairs, and my wife and I cried and opened a bottle of wine. And, it's been 5 years since, and we've been on a pretty good run so far. And so that was the transition, working for someone else to now starting my own firm with no client. Typically most people transition to this world with a client in hand, and we did it the hard way, which is, all right, let's just see what happens. And so that was sort of my story, and it's been a great run so far.
And how did you decide to focus on rare disease?
Oh, great question. So Ultragenics was first, and then the second one I think was Ovid Therapeutics, which is a New York-based company. Jeremy Levin has become a dear friend, not just a client, but a dear friend. And Luke and all of the folks, Jason Tardio, Amit, who's no longer there, as CEO of another company. So, but just working with these great companies, really getting close to them, Emil Kakas, Jeremy Levin, some of these CEOs are innovators, men well, ahead of their time in terms of thinking about how to approach rare diseases. And I just love that. They were disruptors, or they like past tense. They are disruptors, right? And they're passionate about what they do. People like Luke Rosen, who's a rare father. I just love the community. And it reminded me, quite frankly, of being an African-American person growing up in the South and struggling, forcing myself into conversations, inserting myself into certain rooms. And I feel like that's what the rare disease patient community has done. And even these small biotech companies, they're like, you know what, we're here, we're not going anywhere. It's like I feel like the rare disease community and rare moms and rare dads are really fighting for their loved ones the way Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, and others. I mean, not to put too fine a point on it, but it's how I view it. And so I want to be in that fight with them. Simple as that.
Right. Yeah. And don't you think that by the time a rare disease parent, so they've spent so much energy trying to even find a diagnosis,
Yes.
for, in their case, for their children, or a rare disease patient, as an adult, like that they know they have to just keep going and advocate for innovation to solve what now they know they have, which I think it's, we've heard from patients before. I mean, it can take years to even figure out what is going on and so whatever the name of their condition is.
Right. 100%. And this is not to cancer patients. I mean, every community, they're all fighters. Grit and determination is, if you're a mom or a dad who is caring for a loved one. I'm dealing with an issue with my mom now, who's, battling, mental health issues, and it's just a tangled web. So I'm not diminishing any of that. I'm just saying, being close to these rare disease companies, these companies that are fighting to get their therapies in the hands of patients, they're very committed. And these rare moms and rare dads and that whole stakeholder community, they're just determined, and they're like bulldogs. And I just respect them so much. People like Jen McNary, tenacious. And it just reminds me of, people in the civil rights movement who were so tenacious, my forebears. And so I love working with these families, and I love working with these companies, and I feel like that they deserve to be at the policy table, right there along with big companies and other disease states. So that's why I'm in this fight.
Diversity in specifically this industry is really important to New York Bio as well. We have a diversity, equity, inclusion task force, but I'd love to know sort of your thoughts on how the industry can be better at creating opportunities for diverse clinical trial participants in that sort of segment of the industry.
I've thought a lot about this clinical trial issue, and it's not any different from boardrooms. It's not any different from the C-suite. There's not a lot of diversity across the board. And I'm going to say it. I'm just going to say it. Can I just say it? All these Black Lives Matter posters and this diversity inclusion and we're this and all, I don't believe it until I see it. Okay. It's all a bunch of poppycock as far as I'm concerned. You have to live your values. I don't want you to talk about your values. I want you to live your values. And if you say you're patient-centric, prove it to me, okay? Because if you say your diversity and inclusion is important to your organization, prove it to me. And that includes me. I mean, I have an organization, and I've got, I'm the only African-American person in my organization, so I have to prove it to myself and to prove it to the outside world too. So I'm going to answer your question. I think it starts with building a deeper bench. I feel like it's my responsibility. If I want to see a diverse and inclusive KPM group, then I have to live those values. So I have to go out and start working with Howard and some of the universities to build, an internship program or a fellowship program. I have to build a deeper bench. That's the only way you're going to see this change. You're not just going to, otherwise it's just going to be a Band-Aid approach. In my opinion, I'm a lone voice in the wilderness here. I'm sure you've talked to a lot of people who've thought about this. So I don't think you're ever going to get clinical trials improvements until we start building a deeper bench of more scientists, more more people in decision-making authority in these companies. I just really feel like that. And we're a long way from being where we need to be across the board. I mean, I posted on LinkedIn the other day, there's a female biotech effort that like a Davros kind of thing. I think you may have seen that. I love it. Yeah. If you're going to be the change you want to see in the world. Okay. So my answer to you, Mary, is I have to, as someone who cares about this, I have to lean into my definition of what diversity and inclusion means and start living those values in my own organization and in my own life. And I realize that's not an easy answer, or that's probably not the answer you wanted, but I do think that it's going to take time, right? And I don't see it being an overnight success, frankly.
Yeah. One area in our New York Bio Task Force is obviously looking for areas where we don't need to reinvent the wheel, but we can support efforts, because there are a lot of efforts that are ongoing within our community. And one that's been very successful is the city economic development. Has done the LifeSci NYC intern program, and they have recruited interns for the last several years for New York life science companies in the city who have been from diverse backgrounds. And I don't know the stats off the top of my head, but the vast majority of them come from diverse backgrounds that are traditionally underrepresented, which I think is a great way to start showing students that industry is an option for them as a career path.
Right. I agree. And the other thing that, Jennifer, that's so fascinating is that when I've tried to recruit people to KPM for different roles, it's very hard to get African American and minority candidates to raise their hand and like dig a little deep. Like, what is that about? And a lot of it is, because of this is a stereotype, I don't know, gross generalization, but it's the social justice aspect of where a lot of people of color, they want to, working for the government is viewed as it's a way to exact social change or right wrong. So going to a lobbying firm or a public affairs consulting firm, for many of them, it's like, well, I'm not really sure that that's where I want to hang my hat, right? I kind of get doing what I'm doing over here, but are you going to be focused on the things that I care about as professionally? And so that's been a bit of a challenge for us, but I do think I like that. I mean, you just have to, I think, create environments where people can feel safe and can feel that they can be who they want to be, while at the same time, doing right by our clients. So that's sort of how I think about that.
And I do notice that. Thanks, Rich. Rich Robbins says he's always backing me up there. He runs the LifeSite NYC program, and he put his email in the chat if anybody has any questions. And I'm sure they're also recruiting companies to host interns for this summer. So that's a plug for that great program. And then, and we have another, a nice comment from Jana Oberman, who you probably know.
Yeah.
And she said that let's be transparent about the motivation behind DE&I in clinical trials and how to navigate that from a place of integrity. So very insightful. And I think one thing that I feel like we can't have a virtual breakfast series session without mentioning the word pandemic, since the entire breakfast grew out of the pandemic. I think one thing that we may see is an accelerated ability to access clinical trials as they are decentralized. And I think that was borne out by the pandemic and necessity and trying to keep clinical trials going and being able to maneuver. And I think that will long-term, I think it's going to take a while, but have an impact on the diversity of patients available to participate in clinical trials.
Okay. Yeah. Mary, there's a question that came through anonymously. It says, what do you think New York State is doing well, and where do you think there's room for improvement? Wow. That's a great question. I mean, if it's for me, I would say, I think, replicating or cloning Jennifer and her team, because I think you're approaching it the right way. I guess my sense is that, fighting for what you believe in, and I think my only bit of advice, I think, in terms of what you're doing well, I think doing more of this is important, and creating environments for people to speak their truth. It's going to sort of position NewYorkBIO, or continue to position NewYorkBIO, as an authentic place where these conversations can happen, and you're not going to be judged. It's going to be fun and informal. It's not stuffy and haughty, right? There are a lot of, I'm not disparaging any others, but I'm just saying, you want to be perceived that way. But I do think one area that could be helpful is just figuring out what your hedgehog principle is. I keep going back to that. That's from the book Good to Great. And it's where I've spent a lot of time the last 6 months, is really figuring out what's my niche. Like, what's the one thing that I'm going to be the best at, no matter in the world. And KPM, we've sort of leaned into CNS, and we've leaned into rare diseases. And I think and maybe you've done this as a part of your 5-year strategic planning process, is just think about, where does NewYorkBIO, what is your hedgehog principle? And regardless, if everyone in the world comes to you, what's the one thing that you want them to know you for, and you do better than anyone else? And that's because I think you're doing a great job. I don't really have any criticism or critique of what you're doing. I would just say do more of it, but a lot of that is bandwidth, right? So
if you had a criticism, all of a sudden our connection would get unstable. Like, oh, we're losing Patroski. Gotta
go. See you later.
No, I'm just joking. We did have a question from the audience that talks about It says it seems to be common patient engagement comes into play when it is time to recruit for clinical trials. Can you share a success story example when a company engaged patients earlier and what was that outcome? Have you had any clients that have engaged early that you've seen the benefits?
It's still, I mean, it's still pretty early for a lot of the companies that we're working with, but there are a couple of companies, I won't share their names, but they've really, like, early on, one in particular is an international company, and they brought us in very early. I mean, like, oh, do you think it's something we should be focused on? And we're like, oh, absolutely. And then we worked with a patient engagement consultant, and now they've had the PFDD meetings with they've had a patient focused drug development meeting with FDA. They're using a lot of those early conversations they've had with FDA to inform their strategy, their NDA strategy, their go-to-market strategy. So I've seen it. That's sort of my what I've seen companies do. I can't turn to a specific example where a company has engaged a patient advocacy person or engaged with patients. I've even seen companies, another company in particular brought patient groups to the Hill ahead of what is Part B, B meeting, or so you can tell I'm not a regulatory affairs expert, but a meeting they were having with FDA, did a round of Hill meetings, and then actually that led to a letter from the Hill into FDA in support. So it's things like that. You can't ensure outcomes, but what you can do is galvanize support and build a groundswell of community of champions, right? And that's what you're ultimately after, because the FDA, the science has to stand on its merit, right? I mean, the science or the file itself has to stand on its own, but what these other pieces do is give you leverage with the FDA to apply appropriate political pressure if you need to. And that's really what it's all about, is making sure that you have all of your arrows in the quiver working at this, to help support what it is you're trying to do. That's without divulging confidential information. That's all I
can
do.
So Patroski, you and Jennifer and I met when you invited us to one of your Jeffersonian dinners. And for those that don't know what they are, maybe you could just tell us a little about them and how you see it as a tool and the benefits.
Thank you for that. Great question. So we met at a salon dinner that I hosted in DC in New York City last September. And so the salon dinner, so Thomas Jefferson used to host these when he was Secretary of State. He started doing them, didn't call them salon dinners necessarily when he was Secretary of State, in Paris, and he would get people together and they would break bread, drink wine. He was the original Robert Parker, actually. Thomas Jefferson, if you look him up, his wine background, he was the original Robert Parker, had a rating system and the whole bit. Spent this traveling through Bordeaux, through France, Italy, and other parts of Europe, drinking wine and buying wine and all of that. So he was what we call a bon vivant, so really into cultured, all of that stuff. So when he became president, cut to the quick here, when he became president, he would host these salon dinners at Monticello, and he would invite they didn't have a cabinet, or he didn't have a cabinet in a formal cabinet. So he'd invite the key leading figures of the day to dinner, and they would sit and drink a lot of wine, and he would have a single topic. There'd be 8 to 14 people sitting around a table, and they would just talk for 3 hours, and they would discuss war and peace, and he would run the country that way. And so fast forward to now, I've hosted these dinners as a way to bring people together. It's a community. It's a way to build transactional and transformational relationships. I've met some really interesting and fun people going back to 2017 that are still my friends as a result of these dinners. So it's networking, pure networking. That's part of it. The second part is bringing, depending on the conversation, depending on the topic, I bring together unique stakeholders around rare diseases, around CNS, around policy issues. It's a way to really to have informed conversations about important policy topics over dinner and wine, which is, I'm a wine expert in addition to, a convener. And so it's a great way to do that. And so these salon dinners have been a great way to sort of lean into community building and networking, and in a very informal, relaxed environment. And people love them. They do, and they're usually surprised when that of the sort of the organic networking that happens afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I often hear about relationships that are forged and meetings that are planned and business cards and the whole bit that happens behind the scenes, which to me, you want the dinner to live on beyond just a 3-hour dinner. And so when people, some of my clients are like, well, that's just a 3-hour dinner. So what?
Right.
I'm like, well, everyone at this dinner are people that you probably would never meet, but at this dinner, because I've been trying to meet Jennifer for years, and just our paths, and then she comes to the dinner and sits across from me, and we have this great conversation, and it's led to, and same with Derek, it's led to a rich friendship.
Mm-hmm.
That's the genius of these dinners, and I moderate them. I mean, you could do one tomorrow, but I'm really, really good, and I try to view it as, if you were at my home, if you were invited as a guest to my home, what is that experience going to be like if you came to my home and you were having dinner with me and my wife over the course, a 3 or 4 course dinner? That's exactly what I try to create with these dinners. And then so far, so good. People love them. So
yes. We're thankful that people can gather again in person, right? Because let's be honest, Zoom is great for a lot of things, and online platforms. Networking, not as much.
Not so much. And that's part, and let me just say, it matters who's sitting at the table. Because when I send the list around, I'm like, they're like, Jennifer's going to be there, Mary's going to be there, or Eric's going to be there. Okay, let me see. Maybe I'll move what I was going to do on Wednesday night so that I can go to this dinner, because it's been 6 months and I've been trying to have a conversation with Jennifer. Patroski's set up this unique experience, and I can go have dinner and I can meet Jennifer. Does that make sense? So the networking part cannot be underscored more. That it's a part of this. It's not just a policy conversation. It's not just great wine. It's not just great food. All of that matters. But what really matters to people is the opportunity to break bread with interesting people around a topic.
Right. And that small group strategy really works in a time where people are really wanting these connections, are hungry for them again, pardon the pun. But if you could also mention, and you're great on LinkedIn, you share a lot of really interesting comment, and you like to talk about wine. I mean, you mentioned it here. Can you talk about your wine as a strategy view?
Yes, it's all a part of the hedgehog. I'm going to keep hedgehog principle. What is it that you are really, really good at and can be the best at in your craft than anyone else in the world? And I feel like wine, I'm a certified specialist of wine, and I have extensive background as a wine educator. So it's not like someone with a huge wine list that's run around that thinks he or she knows about wine. I actually do. And so that credential allows me to have conversations with people. It's bona fide, for those of us who are from the South and who love that movie, Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? I'm bona fide when it comes to my wine cred. So I use that smartly as a way to bring people together. And so in DC, I've been doing these wine lunches for a decade. I've been once a month, pre-COVID, of course. We would gather together. I would gather together my friends who are lobbyists, who are wine aficionados, who are heads of the trade groups down in DC. So I built this list of about 500 people that that I've developed over the years, and that group is the group that I go to for advice. If I need to bring someone in the organization, I go to this group. If people are if I'm looking to hire someone, I go to this group. If they need to hire someone, and they'll send me an email. So I've been able to develop this sort of wine as a strategy idea as a way to get business done, as a way to build a platform of engagement around my brand. A lot of it's branding, right? And thought leadership, but it's been very effective for me. And these salon dinners, I now have clients calling me, or people calling me to hire me to do these salon dinners because they've there's some magic here. And then the last point I'll mention is that the Friday afternoon photos all started as kind of a gag with my wife and I. Were like, all right, it's Friday afternoon, let's just take a photo and put it on LinkedIn. We're just kind of celebrating the weekend. But soon I was like, oh, wait a minute now. The number of clicks and the number of responses started to sort of grow over time. And then I had clients in calls during the week. And it was a little awkward at first. I'm like on a call with a client and they're like, what are we drinking Friday? Because I can't wait. I'm like, well, really? They're like, oh, Patroski, I know it's the weekend. I know it's Friday because there's someone posting something that's a little bit less serious than the world ending or this, that, and the other. So I look forward to your photos. I'm like, all right. So I've been doing it for almost a year now, and people love it. And it's, again, all a part of branding. And now I have a communications expert, Anna Stallman, who helps me, and Raphael, who helped me with all of that. And it's all coordinated, Mary. And I have no problem sharing that with you and your audience or your guests, because I do think it's important to lean into your brand and figure out what your hedgehog principle and what it is that you want to hang your hat on, and lean into it the same way I have leaned into the wine as a strategy piece.
So one more follow-up, because I know we're short on time. How do you decide what to talk about? How do you decide what the topic for the dinner should be?
It depends on I bring and if it's a client, I bring them into the conversation and we talk about what's your goal? What's your objective here? I have one client, Alexion, that's really thinking a lot about rare disease, bringing the rare disease, rallying the rare disease community around this idea of access and affordability and, center of excellence out there. Should there be, should the FDA think differently about how it reviews these products, right? I mean, I remember someone got in CRL most recently, and they got a CRL from the FDA, and the reviewer had no experience in rare diseases whatsoever. It was like dermatology and something, I can't remember what the second one. So we got to change that. That can't happen, right? So I work with the client to determine what the topic will be. Now, if it's me, and if I'm thinking about, I try to pick broad topics that are open-ended, that invite conversation. You don't want yes or no answers. You want questions that invite people to think broadly and think big or small. Like, are we in the golden age of innovation when it comes to rare disease drug development? That was one question that we hosted. One was around diversity and inclusion. How do we think differently about what does it even mean to be, what's your operational definition of diversity and inclusion? Those are broad questions. And then usually a good question, you just sit back and watch everyone else talk. And all you have to do is just like, all right, well, what do you think? And then pretty soon 2 hours have passed and you've got this rich dialogue and 4 or 5 takeaways that the group says, we need to follow, we need to carry on with this, or we need to build out an agenda around these 4 or 5 issues. And that's happened in several of the dinners. And that's when you know you've had a successful dinner. And that's how you know that it's working, that this concept of works.
Thank you. Anyone who's ever met me knows I am incapable of replying only with a yes or a no. So, Patroski, this was a fantastic discussion today. Thank you so much for being our guest. We very much appreciate it. We hope everyone has a great rest of your Tuesday, and you'll join us again next week. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to New York Bio's virtual breakfast series. Join us every Tuesday at 9 a.m. for more discussions with leaders from across the healthcare spectrum. For more information on New York Bio, please visit us at www.newyorkbio.org.